Um, Welcome everyone to another edition of Talking with Poets, and um, delighted to have with me, well, virtually, but in very much in my heart and mind, Ruth Danon. Ruth, welcome to this YouTube venture where poetry is poetry all the time, all day, all night.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're very welcome. You come to me so highly sort of endorsed and recommended. And I have to say, as a poet, when I opened this book, this amazing book, I don't know if you can all see it, Turn Up the Heat, New Poems. You open the book and then you turn into page after page, like praise song after praise song and interpretation. I mean, we all publish blurbs and so on, but it really is, it's impressive just the way, because it helps also to any reader as a kind of preface, in a sense, to read some of these comments before going into the poems themselves. But of course, the poems, as always do, speak for themselves and are evasive for themselves too. And I'm curious about that. When you write a poem, do you want to both speak clearly to the reader, um, so that the reader can just walk away, digest the poem on that first reading? Or do you, at the same time, want the reader to think, well, it's not quite right, right? I mean, there's something more that I need to, and when does the poem actually get finished? Is that when the reader realizes that there's something more and then goes back? Or does a poem ever get finished? I'm sorry for this very broad philosophic question to begin, but please.
It's a fabulous question. It's a fabulous question. I have in mind almost two or three things.
Yeah,
One is that I want the language itself to be accessible and clear
right.
and appealing to a reader, so that the reader doesn't run away screaming, saying, I don't understand what she's saying.
Right, right.
At the same time, I believe very much what one poet, whose name is smashing out of my head right now, said, which is, if you want to communicate, use the telephone. So that a poem is not a message in a bottle. It's not a, you should go and do this, or you should think this way, or you should feel this way. So I want it to be accessible and mysterious simultaneously. And I feel as though the reader, in some sense, completes the poem by the interaction with the poem. So it isn't just to go away and say, I need to look at it again. It's that what the reader brings into the poem is very much part of the experience of a poem. And I like to think of poems at their best. I don't know that if I achieve it, but at their best, they are experiences for readers.
Yes, I like that sense of
Activity.
experiences. Yeah, I love what you just said about the both clear and mysterious at the same time, right? And the kind of that duality, which, of course, I think a lot about duality. I think about light and dark, and songs of innocence and songs of experience, and and then I think then when I think about other disciplines like painting, for example, I know painters like Edvard Munch and the Scream or something. There's a kind of dark background or depth to some of these poems, mystery mixed with fear and anxiety and ominousness, perhaps. I mean, I know you there are a couple of specific fears you talk about in the book, right? One being the fear of the cold, and that same poet who smashed through your skull is now smashing out of mine. I'm forgetting, but let's talk about whether, let me backtrack and ask another question. When you started writing these poems, did you think you were writing a unified collection, that you were writing to a particular plan of any sort? Go ahead.
The ominousness, I
Yeah.
think, that's there, and I think you're accurate to see it as a subtext.
Mm.
Comes from really a couple of things. One, that I was writing these before, during, and after COVID.
Right.
So there was this darkness about that. It was also written in some sense in sequence with which was my previous book, Word Has It, which was a book in which I was dealing with what it felt like to live before, during, and right after the Trump administration, which was leading right into COVID.
Right.
And so the books, both of which have been published by Nirala, are somehow related to one another. And there is a political subtext to the book. I mean, there are some poems that quite directly address guns or he who shall not be named.
Right. Right.
And so that's there too. And then whatever personal stuff goes on, because life is dark anyway. And the duality of lightness and dark is there. So no, I had no idea I was writing a book. What I
Right.
did was write a lot of poems. And then at a certain point, I had this big mess of poems. And I thought, well, I need to know whether to throw these away or
Oh dear.
whether there's something here.
Mhm.
And since I don't really believe in doing everything alone, because I think that's crazy, I went to my editor, David Groff, who has been very helpful to me and who is a wonderful poet himself. And I said, David, do I have anything here? And he took them away and he did whatever he did. And he came back and he said, yes, I think you have a book. And then he sort of laid out what he saw as some of the continuities. Once he did that, once I knew that I had something, it was actually very easy to put the book
Right. Okay.
together as a book pretty quickly. And there were certain things that I had in mind. One was that I did not want a narrative. I did not want a beginning, middle, and end. I wanted the reader to be surprised so that what happened on page 2, assuming it was a one-page poem, would prepare you for page 3, but that would not be the same as page 2. So I wanted there to be an unfolding, and I also then discovered the idea of the recursive, so that things early on reappear.
Right.
So I put the book together pretty quickly, gave it back to David, and he made some suggestions. Like, you have too many prose poems at the second half of the book, divide them up. And then the one thing he did say that was very important, he said, you need more Bruno, because Bruno turned out to be a very important figure, Giordano Bruno.
Right.
And that was very hard for me. And he said, that's going to be hard for you because you don't write intentionally. You don't start out by saying, I'm going to write about X or I'm going to write about Y. The poems come organically, usually because I write a line and then I follow the line to wherever it's going to go. So he said, but you're going to have to do that because the book needs more Giordano Bruno. And so I did that. And then the book was pretty much done.
Wonderful. David is a sort of a personal editor, or was he associated with the publisher? Or
No,
it's just a
he
technical question for
personal.
personal. Yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, I think of course, everyone thinks of this Ezra Pound editing Eliot and Il Binglio Fabro, the better craftsman. I mean, so anyway, yes, I also support that idea of an editor, of working with an editor,
Yeah,
a
and what's
personal editor or from the press. Yeah.
what his skill is not in changing anything. I
Right.
mean, Pound's skill was in cutting out all
Right.
the bad stuff that Eliot had written and extracting the heart of the poem. David wasn't doing that. He was telling me what was there that I couldn't see
Ah, yes,
and
yes.
trusting me to put it together.
Right, right.
So he didn't do line editing except, very minor, maybe get rid of this or change the title. but nothing major. It was my work and my decisions about the organization.
Okay. Now, why don't we hear a couple of the poems from the book, and then we'll continue talking about them.
Sure. Do you want me to choose, or do you want?
We could just begin at the beginning. I always like Beb's Time Travel. Is that the first? I think that's the first poem in the book. But I'll leave it to you to pick. I mean, I was thinking of that and Turn Up the Heat, but which of course is the title poem.
Yeah, well, I think time travel is a better one to start with because
Okay.
it frames the whole
Right.
book.
Right.
So it's the opening poem. It's called Time Travel. Someday, in what we now call the future, I will write a poem or an essay or a story that begins with a line, "That first winter it snowed often, and I was already edging my way into being old. At that time in the future, I will no longer pass beyond what's called the dummy light to the other side of the street to have delicate blonde streaks woven into my dyed brown hair. I will let myself turn silver and amazed. I will recall that I read mysteries one after another late into the night, hoping that they would help me understand betrayals I didn't yet understand. That winter of frequent snow, it was unconscionably cold, and I was also unconscionably cold, as if warmth would come at too high a price. That winter, the snow seemed beyond relief, clutched in the naked arms of trees. I was edging into age. I was tentative, like a young girl learning to line her eyes with shadow for the first time. That winter, the snow clung to the trees and tumbled into the river that rushed past the place where I lived.
Oh, that's magnificent. You know, this edging my way into being old, that idea, as you put it, and of course there you introduce the theme of aging and poems, aging, age and ages, evils, or whatever. I don't know what that phrase is, but I'm thinking about, and then this dark. I'm looking at the background of your screen there, those stark trees, sort of an appropriate landscape for this poem. Um, I love the idea that I will let myself turn silver and amaze. That's just a magnificently hopeful, generous line for all, silver and amazed. And then of course, then you introduce the theme of the cold, right? And this unconscionably cold. Uh, but then you finish with the river, the rush past the place where I live, and you leave it there for the reader to complete, to finish, to walk into, and that's the art, knowing where to stop, when to stop, and how deftly you stop, So I salute you for that. But I'm again, we're not talking of 2 + 2, right, equals 4. I'm sorry for simplifying the other side's way of of interpreting the world, the scientific approach or something. I mean, this is also a science, isn't it? But it's a kind of experiment leading to illumination. So tell me about that. Are you also in poetry seeking some kind of illumination in the way that in meditation one seeks some kind of I've been reading a lot of Allen Ginsberg lately and teaching, just taught a course based on his work. So I was thinking a lot about breath and in meditation and illumination and the search that he engaged in throughout his life for truth. And I'm thinking how if you could tell us about your own search for truth and how that's related to the practice of writing poems or specifically these poems. I hope that's,
Well, it's a complicated question. I
yeah.
have to think about it for a minute. In some ways, I think that truths come as surprises often. So I think of Bruno, Giordano Bruno, back then when people were still thinking that the earth was the center of everything. Not only was he thinking, no, the earth goes around the sun, but that there's an infinite number of earths and an infinite number of suns. So how does somebody have a vision like that? Because that the earth goes around the sun was fairly obvious to other people. I mean, Galileo, all kinds of people were saying that. That wasn't so hard to figure out, but to imagine, to anticipate the Webb telescope and say there's so much out there, and to defy the Catholic Church and to defy all the known wisdom of the moment, to say that and to have that vision. I think that poems are discoveries. And so how they make their discoveries, I'm not sure. Certainly one of the things that happens in this book, and to me, is I distrust the binaries. I distrust, good, bad, right, wrong. Ethical issues are usually conflicts between two bad things. Because if things were just right and wrong would be easy.
Right.
So I'm sort of constantly challenging propositions or verities and saying, no, we have to unpack this claim. And what is the difference between seeing and interpreting? And how does the act of interpretation either become a form of vision and envisioning or a form of delusion? It could be either one.
A line comes to me from Ginsberg at the moment, where International Crazy Wisdom School, that he was sort of celebrating, that International Crazy Wisdom School. I mean, I think you are also a wise poet, or dealing also with wisdom, or sharing learning on some sense through these pictures, these word pictures that you create and you read it to interpret. And do you want to just go to perhaps one of the poems about Giordano, so for our listeners to tell us a little about Giordano, a little more about Giordano, and then we'll go on. Yeah.
The way that Giordano entered this book is that I went to Sardinia. And I had been to Rome many times, but I'd never been to Sardinia. And in Rome, in the Campo de Fiore, there's a statue of Giordano Bruno, and he was sort of a family hero. I come from a family of communists, intellectuals, scientists, and Giordano Bruno was kind of a family hero. And so I always admired the statue and I always paid respect to the statue. And then I got to Sardinia. And in Sardinia, I was there for the Feast of St. Anthony, who was the other important figure in the book. And that's not Anthony of Padua, that's Anthony of Egypt, who was the patron saint of hermits and deserts. And he was said to have brought fire into the desert and so heat into the world. And when I saw the fires, the bonfires that they build in honor of St. Anthony, these bonfires are bigger than a house. And there's a tree sticking out from the middle, a living tree. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, that's what they did to Bruno. I mean, they put him in the middle of a pyre of wood and they burned him.
Right.
And the two images came together. And that's how it happened. And so I wrote this very long poem about Bruno. And maybe I'll read it, even though it's a little bit long.
No, that's all right.
Because there's another one later on that's much shorter. But I think this one will, in a way, set up the arguments of the book in a way. It's called Against Nostalgia. It's partly prose and partly poetry. It's in parts. I'm not going to read the numbers. I'm just going to pause in between the parts.
Good.
Against nostalgia. In Sardinia, on the days before the festival of St. Anthony the Hermit, also known as St. Anthony of the Desert and St. Anthony of Egypt, the townspeople of Galtali, usually unseen, usually hidden with their dogs behind walls, emerge, cut, gather, and pile twigs and branches around a hollow tree that rises high above a mound of wood. On the day of the feast, the old priest conducts Mass in the bare basement of a new building that brings to my mind Giordano Bruno's cell after he tore in heroic fury the icons from the walls. In a cold basement hall, I sit with others on hard benches and stand with others who, on command, sing with one clear, hegemonic sound. And later, led by others to a shared meal, I push away the pale, boiled mutton flesh. I eat new potatoes, so many little earths orbiting the plate around red radishes that burn my throat. The meal is served silently by women only, dressed in black, to men mostly sitting solidly. We are guests merely in motley. After the meal, I trudge with a silent crowd to the waiting pyre in a stubbled field, absent flowers, where a fire is lit and starts to burn, and I begin with mouth shut tight to take my turn 3 times around the breaking fire. When Bruno was led after 7 years, imprisoned by the inquisitors, into the field of flowers in the heart of Rome, to be burned alive, he was accompanied by men who walked beside him, singing, hoping that at the last minute he would recant his vision, infinite suns and infinite earths, manifest and imminent. Bruno saw far into the future, could almost see the black holes and retreating galaxies of our own time. Into Bruno's mouth they placed a leather gag, so he could not curse or speak or cry. The chief inquisitor, Bellarmine, was later canonized. Later still, the church apologized. A poet wrote, "It hurts to burn." I watched the flames rise higher, then surround the hollow tree. Hours pass, revealed to me expired wood, still warm, twisted, blanched, and white, as Bruno's bright and brilliant bones.
Yeah, that's a bitter, masterful finish there. Bitter, bright, and brilliant boy. I, I can't help thinking of Garcia Lorca, shot, at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, murdered. And but the murder of art, the murder of someone or who, in this case, who was seeing into the future by those who only see, who want to conserve the past or conserve their um, certainties. I don't know. It's just it's there's a poem in India by Arun Kolotka called Jejuri. It reminds me of this poem where in Jejuri, pilgrims come to a temple and they go into the temple and they worship. Uh, and the poem is a series of episodes, sort of different elements in the temple town and then in the temple. Here you go. I mean, this is a poem that is both. It's bold in the sense that it's in form. It has different forms. It's no, it's a rich piece, but you call it against nostalgia. Tell us why.
Well, when I was in Sardinia, we were in this very old town,
Mm.
Galtali. And I mean, really old. And it was freezing cold there. I mean, my place was an ex-monastery.
Mm.
So there was no light, there was no heat. And it was up a hill, so we had to walk up and down hills all the time. And there were people around who were constantly commenting on the quaintness and the prettiness and niceness of everything. And I didn't find it nice. And one day I was talking to Forrest Gander, who was there, and we both sort of looked at each other and said, you know, all this nostalgia is really annoying. And I really do feel that sentimental attachment to the past gets us into a lot of trouble. You could read MAGA here if you want
Right. I was just thinking that you're
that. Um, and then later on in the book, I have a poem against theory. So there's a way in which ideas that are detached from fact and truth annoy me. And I guess that's what the title of it is. It's sort of this feeling that there was a falsification of the meaning of this quaintness. I mean, there we were, you know, we were the guests, and we were being treated very nicely, and we were a mixed group, men and women. But the rest of the people there in this hall before the bonfire, they were all men. They were all being waited on by women. The women were not allowed to sit down or eat or do anything. It was hard to feel nostalgic about that.
right.
And then one of the really funny things that happened, people were incredibly nice to us. I mean, it was people could not have been nicer. And one of the things about Galtali is that everybody sings. There are endless amounts of singing and endless numbers of churches in which the people sing. And we're always invited to be entertained. So one night or evening, we were entertained in this little church, and the little group that was singing, mostly women, maybe all women, they were singing American songs because they wanted to please the American group. And so one of the songs they sang was Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah.
Hallelujah, is it?
Hallelujah, yeah.
Hallelujah. Okay.
But they had to take out all the sexual stuff.
And you said these are Muslim women singing Hallelujah.
Yeah, it's about Mother Teresa.
Right. Okay.
Instead of the Holy Ghost moving in me, or whatever the line is that Cohen has. And that just made me laugh. I mean, it was just, again, this kind of refusal to be in the world as it actually is.
Right. Right.
I don't like that. So that's why it's against nostalgia.
Right. Now, there's also, I mean, yes, so there is definitely this background of the tyrant and the tyrant's um, ideology. And then you have the sort of the domestic poem, the scene, the kitchen, the table. What can you talk about? Let's say the poem "Trouble" on page 29, where you say, "In the kitchen I discover desire. That is to say, I discover a lack of what I want. Tonight, scallions and curry. I have shallots and onions, some red and some yellow, and many other items I favor, whether I need them or not. There's an ice storm in the valley tonight, and Texas, an energy-producing state, as they say, is trapped in ice and experiencing a grave lack of power. The black ice in our town produces great sadness in my husband because he desires snow falling. He experiences an immediate and immense lack of snow. His is a simple desire and a huge emptiness." That's a very moving line, you know. His is a simple desire, huge emptiness. The whole poem is very moving for me, but it's also political. I mean, at least I read into the Texas and the energy producing state, and trapped in ice, the irony of that. But how much of does the reader, if a reader from the proverbial Mars comes to the poem, do you need to have some background in America and the American dilemmas of American democracy to extract that reference? I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, I certainly helped. I mean, if you
Yeah.
knew that the grid in Texas failed,
Right.
you could read more into the poem. There is a strong strain in the book about long marriage, a marriage that lasts a long time and has its troubles, because
Yeah.
relationships do have their troubles.
Right. Right.
Nothing is easy. Anybody who says it's easy is out of their minds. But there is a larger thing here, which is, and it's been, I think, in all of my books, in all of my work, this feeling about desire and lack, longing for
Desire
desire and lack.
and lack of lack. Yes. Sorry.
Some ways the speaker in this poem is projecting something of her own emptiness into the husband, but his is also real. And it's this desire for things you can't have.
Right.
And of course, that there is a political dimension to that, because we desire a country we would like to live in,
Right.
and we don't have that.
We don't have that.
We're less and less likely to have that.
I think it's fair to say you're unsparing with your. You speak truth slant, so to speak. I mean, to cite that famous.
Well, I grew up with science, with politics, I'm first generation. My parents, came over after World War II. They were refugees.
They came over from.
Well, my mother was Hungarian. She went from Hungary to Italy because my grandfather had been a minister in the very short-lived communist government of Bela Kun. But then they went to Italy, and then my mother eventually was educated in Italy. She went to medical school there. She graduated in 1939, even though the Jews had been kicked out of the university in 38.
Right.
Because she was Hungarian, they allowed her to finish.
To finish, knowing that she was a Jew.
Knowing she was a Jew.
Yeah. Okay.
And then she got all of her brothers, two brothers, she got them out. She got her father out. My grandparents were separated. Got my grandfather out and his second wife, and got them to Brazil. And then in 1942, she and my grandmother got to Argentina by way of Paraguay. And they went into the country illegally. They went into Argentina illegally. And then only by a fluke did they end up here, because one of my uncles got to the United States, was immediately drafted, sent to the Philippines towards the end of the war, had a jolly time in the Philippines, actually. The war ended. He became an American citizen instantly. He could bring his mother here. My mother and grandmother went to the consulate to get my grandmother's visa. The consul looked at my mother and said, an old lady should not travel alone, and gave my mother a visa. Otherwise, she never would have gotten it. So all of that forms the background of my life and my childhood.
Right.
And I grew up on the grounds of a mental hospital, and all the doctors there, when we moved there, they were mostly refugees, and some were Jewish and came from China, and some were Nazi sympathizers, and some were in the Polish underground, and nobody ever talked about any of it.
And so, your mother then was born in Argentina, or
She was born in Hungary.
in Hungary, and then was in Argentina when she came.
She moved to Italy in 1919 or 1920 after the revolution failed. The revolution lasted 132 days. Then it was over. And then Hungary had the first fascist government in Europe. And she went to Italy, and then at 16, she was sent back to Hungary. Then she went back to Italy to go to medical school. And then she graduated, and then she went to Paraguay, and from Paraguay, she crossed into Argentina.
Hmm.
And I was born here, not so long after she got here. So I'm American by a fluke.
Right. I'm fascinated by these stories because of, my own migrations, and migration generally is a theme that interests me. I'm curious if you've written about those your mother, grandmother in other books or up
I'm
at.
writing a memoir. I'm writing a memoir, which I'm almost finished with, and it deals a
Wonderful.
lot. It never really become the subject of my poems, except in my very, very, very first chapbook, I had a poem about it. But
Okay.
I tend to write more from where I am at any given moment.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier about sort of being skeptical about dichotomies and so on, black and white or light and dark and so on. Guns or butter? Now, what's is that a kind of, well, it's an ironic title, I suppose.
Yes, and it was, in a way, this is an allusion to my family because they always talked about guns or butter.
Hmm.
Obviously, they were on the side of butter. Uh, and it has a historical reference that is in the epigraph of the poem.
Right.
The poem came about because I was teaching, and I was working with my students on writing epistolary poems. And so I thought, well, I'll write an epistolary poem. And that's what happened. It just showed up that way.
Right.
And I think I was also annoyed at my husband about talking all the time about the end of the world, but not actually doing anything about the end of the world.
Right. Right.
So I think it came out of both of those things,
One of those things.
impatience with talk and no action.
Right. Right. Actually, we could spend a wonderful time about each of these poems. I don't know. I'm sort of picking and through the book at the moment, but I I do want to ask. Go back to the title, "Turn Up the Heat." Uh, what is and to sort of extrapolate from the title, both in the book and also what you have to say for us these days, the times that we're living in. How does that metaphor, turning up the heat, apply to? I'm not asking you to tell me how to live my life or how to,
Oh,
who I should vote for, and so on. But I'm trying to understand whether that I can take that phrase and then um, have a kind of a revelation or some kind of a click. Maybe I'm trying to have both ways. Just wanted to
it's a
riff a
great,
little bit about the title. Yeah,
it starts from the simplest and the most literal. I
yeah,
hate the
right, right,
Okay, so I hate the cold. Fine. Everybody's bored to tears with my complaining about being cold. Then there is this notion of, well, what kind of cold are you talking about? Okay, there's snow in winter and that's cold. Then there's a coldness of spirit, a coldness in the heart, and a kind of self-examination about that. To what extent do I carry coldness within me as a protective device or
mm,
uh, a stance to the world, not emotional enough or something like that. So it's a self-critique in that sense. Or at least an interrogation, at least is it questioning
right, right.
of where is this coldness and what does it come from?
Would,
Then there's this idea of turning up the pressure. And what kind of pressure are we turning up and what for? And I think it has to do with, to put it in the simplest possible terms, train yourself to see. I mean, there's a line in the book about I'm training myself to see, or I'm learning to see. And if we learn to see, then we will see what is happening around us.
right.
And we will have to turn up the heat to contend with it.
Uh,
And there are many ways of doing that. And simple binaries, I will always reject simple binaries because life and history is so complicated.
Yep.
And art to me seems the one place where that mystery can be really explored. And of course, one of the interesting things about Bruno that nobody talks about very much, but he went everywhere. They traveled all over the place in Europe, constantly getting in trouble. But one various moment of his existence, he was in England and he was hanging out with Shakespeare and those poets. And so for all the scientific thinking, there was also this, tearing the icons down and creating something new that he was constantly involved with. And so for me, the simple, well, I keep thinking of that song from the 60s from, my revolutionary era, you know, and there's a line in it about, you know, something's happening here, what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there saying, beware. And then there's a line there, people carrying signs, mostly saying, hooray for our signs.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the idea that there is a simple solution to complex problems just doesn't work. So that's the kind of heat I want to turn out, which is to look at what is actually happening.
Yeah, a wonderful, rich answer, which I think really anyone who watches this conversation will benefit because it's a parallel answer. I mean, one just should listen to it as and then read the poem. Would you read "Turn Up the Heat" for us?
It's funny, this poem that I wrote, and I was in conversation with another poet. We were sending poems back and forth, and I wrote this poem, and I said, Elaine, I hate this poem. I said, it's a really good poem. And so it ended up being the title poem. So it's good, not to trust your own judgment about
Right, right. And go to the editor, whoever that
be
editor is.
skeptical. Be skeptical about your judgments.
Right, right.
Turn up the heat. All day we have been talking one way or another about heat. We wanted at first a two-faced wood stove, one that would warm one room and another at the same time. Then we thought of two wood stoves, easier to install, less damage to the structure of the room. Those who know me know that I fear nothing more than I fear cold. We decided on two stoves that could be installed at different times that would serve different needs. We all have needs, but they are not always the same needs. My need is to avoid cold. My need is not to be afraid of what I fear. Later, we talked about fear, how some are afraid to walk down the streets at night, or afraid to step outside of the house now that the entire planet is sick. My fear seems small, just the cold frightens me. They say that what we most fear is what will kill us. In the hospital, where I spent too much time, I begged for warm blankets. Sometimes they had them, sometimes not.
This is truly a very, very powerful poem. I'm one of my absolute favorites in the book, and I'm glad you survived that visit to the hospital, or whoever the speaker this poem did.
It was pretty
To be
bad.
able to, pretty bad, to be able to write this poem. The line, "We all have needs, but they're not always the same needs," is absolutely spot on. Um, and then you go on to announce your own need. My need is to avoid cold. I mean, you're self-reflective, you're humorous, you know, and you speak truth. I mean, you just speak truth to reality. I mean, there's a line about speaking truth to power. I mean, that's what is helpful about poetry. I think this exploring experience through language, through musical language, trying to sort of get the beat right, at the same time as well. Get the heartbeat down on the page. And you do that in this poem and throughout this book. I mean, am very, very grateful to have had this chance to. I mean, I use this cliche, a deep dive. I don't think I'm only just sort of skimming at the moment, but here and there I've gone into each poem and found an ever complex, reality. So that's the loveliness of it, right? Unfolding one layer and then you get into another layer. So that sensation of discovery, which in the domesticity of each scenario that you present to us, with at the same time this backdrop of a national and a sort of an international chaos or crisis, that it's a it's a tricky book because that's not announced, but if you just took the phrase "turn up the heat" and out of context, you might be thinking that, well, now's the time to get things done, get this ship righted, get this, I mean, I'm just thinking of the inspiring things we can do to get the vote out or something, but no, we are dealing with two compromised and, and jaded and characters competing with each other for the next election. But one is a little bit better in a sense. I'll stop there. I don't mean
It's not a fascist, and one is.
to. Sorry. Yeah.
Right? One is not a fascist and one is.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
That's an important distinction.
Yes. Yes. Um, now, just I think we can perhaps close. This is just. I mean, I hate to close a conversation. It's not for me to stop. But let's talk about a little bit also about the poet as teacher, the poet as guide, the poet as prophet, the poet as I don't know. I'm also getting involved a lot with teaching these days. I was just teaching a course on Allen Ginsberg, and I was thinking, what more fitting poet to read at our time, the time we're living in now, again, or to read him now. So tell us about teaching. I think of Socrates or someone teaching. Is the poet necessarily a teacher, a sharer of truths gained from experience and from divine inspiration, or from just tell us a little bit about the role of the poet in our society. Perhaps maybe that's the question I want to ask.
Well, that's a very big question. I can talk a little bit about how I see my own role,
Right.
Which may be very different from how other poet teachers see themselves. I believe that my job is not to be in the way, is to get out of the way.
Mm.
So I think of myself as an instigator.
As an
Instigator.
instigator, yes,
a
yes.
process
Right.
that allows people to discover who they are as writers.
Ah, beautiful.
And I do this. I mean, my favorite book about teaching is called Teaching with Your Mouth Shut.
Mm.
And although I love to talk, and in fact, my students actually love it when I do talk, I don't actually think it's how people learn. I think people learn by doing. So in my classes or instigations, there are a couple of things going on. One is that I create constraints. Constraints are not prompts, they're not subject matter. I usually have some sort of physical action that the students perform. I have some sort of formal structure and some sort of linguistic structure or base. The students write in my presence. So it's not a critique workshop. We do critique privately and in conference, but not in the group. In the group, they're writing. I was led to this. It was a long process, and I don't want to, tell you my whole history, but the crucial moment was that I'd already started doing this. I had people sitting on my floor and they were writing, and I was giving them all this stuff that I'd initially learned from Kenneth Koch in his book called Wishes, Lies, and Dreams, which was about teaching children. And I started to use that approach because I learned that if I asked adult students to go home and write something, they would write crap. I didn't want that. I didn't want to read it. So I started having them write in class. And then many, many years later, I was in psychoanalysis, which I've been in most of my life. And I was talking about my teaching. And my analyst one day handed me an article and said, I think this is what you're doing. And it was an article by the British psychoanalyst W.D. Winnicott, who in my mind is a total genius, a wonderful man. And the article was called On the Capacity to Be Alone. And he writes in this essay that children develop the capacity to be alone by playing in the presence of a non-interfering, observing other. And the light bulb went off, and I said, that's what I'm doing. And so what I have to do is create a playground. And in the playground, the writers will play. I will observe them. I will set up the play so that they can't do it wrong. I'm constantly saying, you can't do it wrong. All you have to do is be curious about what you're doing. We're not judging here. There's no way to do it wrong. And then I create these instigations. And I certainly was influenced by surrealism and surrealist practice. I was influenced by Oulipo, the French and Italian group of writers, Georges Perec and Harry Matthews from America, all these writers who used almost mathematical constraints. I once had a big chat with Harry Matthews about it. And Harry said, you can never violate the constraint. And I say, you have to violate the constraint. That's the point.
Right.
We had a friendly, amicable disagreement.
Right.
And the other source that I use, or the other sort of methodology that's been important and influential, although not exactly what I do, is the work that Jackson McClough and John Cage did with chance operations, which does have a kind of Buddhistic orientation. I'm not a Buddhist myself. But so those were the kinds of practices that influenced the way that I would shape instigations. It's always important that there be physical action because writing comes from the body, that there be language because you make things with words, not with ideas. The ideas come out of the words and out of the body that you are. And then some sort of formal structure so that people don't feel unsafe, that the structure gives them a way of having containment that they can then break out of. And so it's never loyalty to the exercise that I want, it's always loyalty to the poem.
Yeah.
That sort of summarizes what I do.
Thank you for that, because I think all listeners will thank you for that because you know, that's the gift that keeps giving, right? It's the generosity that's in you, and we're grateful for it. And tell us now about you're working on and you're almost finished this memoir. You're
Yes,
writing other poems.
it covers my life from the time I was around 5 when we moved to the hospital grounds, and the time when my mother left the hospital and finally moved into a normal house in a normal part of the town. That was a long time. I was already in graduate school when she left the hospital.
I see.
And so I'm not fond of memoir per se. I mean, I'm not interested in here's what happened to little old me. What I'm interested in is using my own experience as a vehicle to explore history itself.
Right. And that's the
on people's lives.
wonderful. Tell me, where was that hospital? I mean, we're talking
New York, Binghamton.
in New York.
Yeah, it was called the Binghamton State Hospital. Then it became the Binghamton Psychiatric Center. And now it's pretty much not any of them. And one of the things that I cover in the book is a terrible moment of the deinstitutionalization. When, for example, my mother, who was in charge of a children's hospital, children's unit, to like 50 very, very sick boys. He was given 2 weeks to dismantle the unit. And some of these children had to go 500 miles away. Their parents would never be able to see them because they couldn't afford to travel miles away. So that's where the book ends, with that disaster, and there are lots of disasters in the book. But I remember my mother saying very vividly, they're saying that the community will take care of these people. And my mother would say, what community? There is no community. These people are going to end up on the streets.
Right.
It was absolutely right.
So they were being sent 500 miles away from their families and so on.
Yeah.
To another institution or another,
And the adults were just put out on the street.
On the street. I think, I mean, we've talked of Saint Anthony and Giordano Bruno. We've talked about the fear of the cold. We've talked about the backdrop of this ominous backdrop of political sort of fear, uncertainty that on which these poems are written, sketched, whatever. I'm just trying to think of sort of a way to finish without finishing. Would you like to read, perhaps to conclude? Let's leave on your words heard, and we'll stop there. And first, before we do, I just want to say just some details. The book, Turn Up the Heat, New Poems, published by Nirala, Nirala, and Ruth Danon, who is a teacher, who is a poet, and present tense. There's no was, though has had, of course, different teaching positions in the past, but let's just remember these basic things: poet, teacher, and friend. Ruth.
Thank you, John. I'm going to read a very small poem, a prose poem, called Confusion of Tongues. It's on page 66.
66, yeah.
When I said constellation, my friend heard consolation, and my friend was not far wrong. I was talking about the constellations of words that form the grounding of my so-called work, life, my constellations. Thus, light and heat, heat and light, light and air, water and light, fire and light, air and light, light and light.
You leave us with a conundrum and a playful sort of riff on this binary, fully skeptical of the binary. But you end up with light and light, and I want to just add one more light so that I can feel positive and whole, because I like working in threes. But anyway, well done. Thank you for turning up the heat, sorry. And look forward to the memoir. Look forward to your next book of poems as well, whenever that comes up. And look forward to more conversations with you, Ruth, and grateful for this time.
I'm very grateful to you. Thank you very, very much. It was a joy.
Thank you. And good luck with your next, and if you're reading in town, wherever your town is, for those, let me know so I can make sure we let people know.
Yeah, I'm reading in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn. Very good.
And in a couple of weeks, I'm going to Nepal.
That should be amazing, amazing. Another amazing amazement waiting for you. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. I'm going to sorry.